October 24, 1929, Wall Street. The air didn't smell like money anymore. It smelled like ozone and sweat. History tells you that on this day, brokers were raining from the sky like confetti. It's a vivid image. It's also a lie. There were no mass suicides on Black Thursday. That's a myth we invented to make sense of the carnage. The real suicide wasn't physical. It was psychological. A total, systemic collapse of the social imaginary. I'm Psyche of Power. Today, we dissect the Great Depression, not as a failure of banks, but as a failure of the human hardware. To understand the fall, you have to understand the high. The 1920s weren't just roaring, they were a manic episode. For the first time, the average Joe felt like a god. Credit was the new religion, and the ticker tape was its scripture. This was the greater fool theory in its purest form. You buy garbage because you believe a bigger idiot will buy it for more. This wasn't greed. It was self-efficacy bias. They believed the upward curve of the market was a law of nature, like gravity. Here is the first truth: the crash didn't destroy wealth. It destroyed the illusion of wealth, and in a debt-based economy, the illusion is more real than the gold. When the crack appeared in 1929, the reaction wasn't logic. It was Knightian uncertainty. Frank Knight argued that risk is something you can calculate. Uncertainty is something you can't. When the market crashed, people didn't just lose money. They lost the ability to predict the future. And the human brain hates the unknown more than it hates pain. Then came the bank runs. This is where the psychology gets hardcore. A bank is a temple of trust, but trust is a fragile neurotransmitter. One whisper, one availability heuristic, and the temple burns. People didn't withdraw money because they needed it. They withdrew it because they thought others would. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma. If everyone stays calm, everyone survives. But the rational individual choice is to be the first one to betray the system. This is the fear spiral. When you hoard cash, you kill the velocity of money. When the velocity stops, the heart of the economy stops beating. The Great Depression was a self-fulfilling prophecy. We were so afraid of a collapse that we literally willed it into existence. Enter Herbert Hoover, the man history loves to hate. But Hoover wasn't a villain. He was a victim of cognitive dissonance. He believed in voluntarism. He thought the American spirit could overcome the math. He was wrong. The Hoovervilles weren't just slums. They were physical manifestations of learned helplessness. In 1967, Martin Seligman discovered that when organisms are hit by repeated trauma, they can't control. They stop trying to escape, even when the door is opened. By 1932, the American public was Seligman's dog. They were shocked so many times by the market, they simply lay down in the dirt. This is the economic nocebo effect. If you believe the medicine is poison, your body will react as if it is. The factories were still there. The workers were still there. The resources were still there. But the will was gone. We think of the depression as a lack of money. It wasn't. It was a lack of ontological security. Money is a collective hallucination. In 1932, the hallucination broke. The paper returned to being just paper. Then came the man with the cigarette holder, FDR, his first words. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a psychological intervention, a neuro-linguistic programming of a broken nation. The fireside chats. This was the first time a leader entered the parasocial space of the citizen. He wasn't talking to the public. He was talking to you. He was hacking the oxytocin levels of the American psyche. The New Deal wasn't just about jobs. It was about behavioral activation therapy. If you are depressed, the therapist tells you to move, to do anything. The WPA was a national prescription for movement to combat the learned helplessness. But did it work? Economically, the New Deal was a mixed bag. Psychologically, it was a masterstroke of placebo economics. However, the fear spiral has a darker exit strategy. When people are desperate, they don't just want a job, they want a father figure. This leads us to terror management theory, TMT. TMT suggests that when humans are reminded of their mortality, through hunger or poverty, they cling to worldview defense. They seek out in-group superiority. They look for enemies to blame for their existential terror. America narrowly escaped its own version of fascism during the Depression. Why? Because the New Deal gave the fear spiral a constructive outlet instead of a destructive one. But the fear spiral was still there, lurking in the subconscious. Consider the social proof of the 1930s. If your neighbor is starving, you feel the hunger even if your stomach is full. This is empathetic distress. It creates a secondary trauma that paralyzes consumption. The Depression wasn't just a down cycle. It was a regime shift in the human brain. The Great Depression generation was biologically rewired. Their amygdala, the fear center, was permanently enlarged. For 50 years after, they would hoard rubber bands, aluminum foil, and pennies. The fear spiral had become a scar tissue. Epigenetics suggests that trauma can be passed down. We are still carrying the fear spiral of 1929 in our genetic code. In 1937, it happened again, a relapse. This is where the psychology gets really grim. The post-traumatic stress of the first crash made the second dip feel like the end of the world. COGMITEREVRSL3. Here is the most uncomfortable truth. The Great Depression didn't end because of good policy. It ended because of total war. WI was the ultimate cognitive reset. It replaced the fear of poverty with the fear of annihilation. War provided the purpose that peace could not. It gave the fear spiral a target. Suddenly, the learned helplessness was gone. Why? Because the state took over the will to power. The individual was absorbed into the colossus, and the colossus didn't care about market fluctuations. The same men who stood in line for soup now stood in line for rifles. The psychology of poverty had been swapped for the psychology of sacrifice. We didn't solve the economic problem. We just found a bigger problem to drown it out. You think we are different now. You think the fear spiral is a relic of history. But look at your phone. Look at the doom scrolling. The availability bias is now 10,000 times faster. We have built a global fear spiral, a digital architecture designed to trigger your Knightian uncertainty, every 15 seconds. Inflation, recession, collapse. These aren't just words. They are cognitive triggers. We are still the same greater fools. We just have better graphics. The euphoria trap of the 1920s is exactly like the stimulus manias of today. The ghost of 1929 isn't in the history books. It's in your prefrontal cortex. So, how do we break the spiral? How do we escape the architecture of despair? The Stoics had an answer. Premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. If you accept the uncertainty as a fundamental law, it loses its power to paralyze you. You have to build a psychological circuit breaker. You have to stop the negative feedback loop by refusing to participate in the social proof of panic. The Great Depression taught us that the economy is a psyche of power. It is a reflection of our collective mental health. When the mirror breaks, the world breaks. We are currently living in the echo of that great collapse. The fear spiral is always one news cycle away, one black swan event. But remember, you are the programmer of your own internal market. You don't have to be a victim of the Knightian Uncertainty. You can be the certainty in the Knightian world. History doesn't repeat, human nature does. This has been a journey into the dark heart of the economy. Subscribe to Psyche of Power. Don't just watch history. Understand the mind that made it. Because the only thing you have to fear is the fact that you aren't in control. Yeah.